Despite the challenges brought on by the pandemic, recent elections in Massachusetts drew record turnouts. That also includes Boston, where the November turnout surpassed the levels for presidential elections going back to 2008. But a new report from MassVOTE shows there was also a significant difference in turnout levels, a gap that lines up with income and race. To tell us about the gap and how it might be narrowed is our guest from MassVOTE, the Policy and Communications Manager, Alex Psilakis. Thank you very much for being with us, Alex.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Alex, I mean, I think we've heard about the big picture quite a bit from people, and we keep hearing that term record turnout. And at the same time, you say in this report there was also some disappointingly low turnout. So how can those two things be happening at the same time?
Sure. I think we really started to recognize that there was a bit of an issue in October when voting by mail was taking place. And what we were really starting to see, as the votes were coming in, were primarily suburban communities were voting by mail heavily. And then the urban communities like Boston weren't voting by mail as much. When early voting in person started taking place, a couple more, more people started turning out, but not as many. So by the end of the election, around November 3rd, we knew that these suburbs were seeing that record turnout, but we knew that the more urban communities like Boston weren't seeing that record turnout. So we saw these little differences going on during the election, but we really wanted to figure out just how big are these differences and what are some of the causes.
For some people, voting by mail seemed to be convenient. You didn't have to pay for the postage. You have to make sure you signed things correctly. But why was that a less workable option apparently for some voters?
Well, voting by mail isn't as easy and accessible in cities like Boston. For the elections in September and November this year, for example, ballots had to go out in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese. Those ballots and those applications weren't always mailed out on time. Applications and ballots weren't always mailed out to everybody that was supposed to get one. Sometimes the city just got so overwhelmed that they weren't able to mail everything that they needed to. So I think just the lacking of infrastructure, makes it a little bit harder for people to vote by mail, but also in underrepresented communities, especially Black and Hispanic communities, there's a lot of mistrust around vote by mail. They've been told for so long, how important voting in person is. And, throughout history, they've had trouble voting. There have always been barriers to voting. They're most confident when they can go cast that ballot in person and see it deposited. So just out of past hesitation, they want to vote in person. And due to the pandemic, those numbers vary. So we're not only fighting this two-front battle of making voting easier in person, but also trying to convince folks that voting by mail is a perfectly safe alternative.
Well, aside from voting in person, especially on election day, another option is to cast a ballot in a drop-off box. Why is that so important?
Yeah, sure. One of the great things about drop boxes is when you put that ballot in the drop box, it goes directly to the city. You don't have to worry about the postal service mailing it. You know that it's going directly to the city. And one thing Boston did especially well is in the general election in November, they placed drop boxes at highly trusted, spots in the city, particularly at all the public library locations. There was a chilling effect in other communities you saw where drop boxes were placed by police stations, for example. And after the, somewhat of a, the burning of the ballot drop box in Copley Square, which was handled very effectively and quickly, other communities, especially suburban communities, started posting actual police officers at drop boxes, and that creates an even more of a chilling effect, which we don't want to see. So one thing that Boston did really well is what we hope to see repeated in the future, placing these drop boxes uh, in trusted community spots like libraries where you can drop off the ballot at your own convenience and know that it's going directly to the city.
I'm talking about turnout levels. The big picture was record levels for the whole state of Massachusetts. You looked a little more closely and you noticed a pattern that some places had higher turnout than others, and that seemed to line up with race and income. So, what does that map look like for you?
Sure. We talk a lot about, and we've talked a lot about over the past year, especially vast systemic inequality in the city, in the state, and in the country. And with this report, we wanted to prove it. We wanted to show that it's not just a talking point, it's a fact. So, in communities that are almost exclusively white, where income is over $200,000 a year on average, voting rates are near 90%. In a city like Boston, which is an incredibly unequal city in and of itself, communities like Chinatown and Dorchester and East Boston have much lower incomes, have far more diverse populations, and unfortunately have lower voter turnout rates. And we believe that there are barriers to voting in those communities. Registering to vote is harder. Getting out to vote in person is harder. Voting by mail is less accessible. So with this report, we really just wanted to highlight all of that.
I know from the map in Boston, I think the turnout levels in almost all the precincts of West Roxbury were between 72 and 84%. In other precincts in Boston with more people of color, I saw figures from the high 40s to the high 60s. Isn't that a pretty big difference?
It is. It's an extremely big difference. There's one issue in Boston that's not talked about too much, but we talk about in this report, and it's the re-precincting of Boston. And the way Boston's precincts are drawn is normally in communities every 10 years with the census, cities redraw their precinct boundaries so the same amount of people live in a precinct in each city. And precincts are important because for each precinct, there's a polling place. And if one precinct has more people than another, there are going to be longer lines to vote at those polling places. A special law was passed in Massachusetts 100 years ago to basically give Boston a pass and say you don't have to re-precinct. And as a result, the city's precincts are totally out of whack. The average precinct in Boston has about 1,700 people, but in Chinatown, there are over 7,000 people. So there are far longer lines to vote. There are just far more difficulties with voting. So these are the sort of institutional barriers we talk about, barriers that have existed for a very long time that just make it harder to have your voice heard and contribute to the gaps in income and that we talk about in the report.
As you point out in the report, people of color, especially Black and Latino populations, they're more likely to be renters. Renters are more likely to move between elections and have a problem with updating their registration, maybe. So, how could same-day registration make a difference with that?
Yeah. Same day registration, it's a very simple process that's used in more than 20 states. Individuals are allowed to register to vote or update their registration through up to and on election day. So that's important because if there's early voting like there was in Boston last year, then they can do it 2 days before, they can do it on the day whenever. Um, and that's important because, people move all the time, especially as you mentioned, low income individuals and renters. And when you're moving, the last thing you think about is your voter registration. You've got so many other things to worry about that's at the bottom of the list. This reform would be very simple. All you have to do is show up at the new polling place you want to vote out in the new city you live in, and you simply present an ID and you fill out the necessary paperwork on the spot and you're able to vote. And it doesn't have to be a photo ID because in Massachusetts, we do not have photo ID laws. You could simply present a utility bill. It would be that simple. Even a bank statement, something that would have your address on it and your name. So just by implementing that simple policy, people that are experiencing all these other barriers would have one barrier removed. They would be able to update their registration or register on the spot and ultimately have their voice heard.
It's been done in other states already. Briefly, anything that you can say about how that affected turnout?
Yeah, it's shown to increase turnout at a minimum 4%, upwards of 12%. And it's been shown especially to increase turnout in these underrepresented communities, in Black and Brown communities, low income communities, and immigrant communities, because these are the ones who are moving more often. They're the ones that kind of put the voter registration at the bottom of the list because everybody else does. But whereas other communities, might be easier to update your registration, it might not be as easy here. So this reform just fixes it across, all sorts of lines.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us and explain all that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.
Alex Psilakis from MassVOTE. We'll have more news in just a moment.